Well, hi everyone. This is now the week of April 6th. I guess we're making a habit out of this because we're now in our third week of the remote learning, and I think you all know by now that Monmouth is online for the rest of the semester. So that's it. I hope you're not getting too sick of these videos. I'm doing my best in recording them. It's kind of awkward for me, and I've given up making predictions about how short they're going to be because it seems like every time I say this is going to be a short one, I end up recording for almost 30 minutes. So I'll just forego that. So the instructions on eCampus were to finish the play for today. I hope you enjoyed this play. This is one of my favorite plays. The subject matter itself is kind of difficult at times because there's some pretty emotional and disturbing topics that are dealt with, mainly the prospect of a priest possibly sexually abusing a child. And I want to, as we typically do, so we're back into the format of a lecture and then a mini quiz. So after you listen to this lecture, keep track of the 3 different points that I make here, and then you'll take this into the mini quiz that is posted to eCampus. So the first point I want to explore involves the subtexts of of this play. And what I mean by that is one of the things I like so much about this play is how clever it is and how intelligent it is. And one of the ways I think it establishes its intelligence is by making the reader interpret the signs and the signals that are given by the characters. And scene 5, to me, is really the fulcrum point of the play because of all of the things that are left unsaid, that the reader really has to kind of read between the lines and imagine what characters' intentions are. So remember that Sister Aloysius and Sister James, or at least Sister Aloysius herself, has already made up her mind, essentially, that Father Flynn is guilty. So they call him into her office. So this is scene 5, and you can see the setting is the principal's office. That's Sister Aloysius. And I want to kind of just trace how Shanley, the author, makes so much of what goes on here very much subtextual. And again, sort of, this is important to me because it connects to this historical context of the Catholic Church keeping things unsaid for so many years, right? There was suspicion that priests had been abusing children for decades, and nothing was done about it. It was only rumored and whispered, and it finally took the Boston Globe's reporting in the early 21st century to sort of open up the scandal, and really it exploded. But for so long, everything had been left unsaid. I think it also connects to the way in which characters hold tight to their beliefs. Sister Aloysius, for example, is a woman of tremendous conviction. She is extremely inflexible, reminds us a little bit of Antigone, but in the way that she has her ideals and she refuses to be moved from them. I think all the characters in this play have these fixations or these stubborn beliefs that they just don't want to get rid of. Even Sister James, who in large part is the most likable and the most innocent of all the characters, even she has her very stubborn beliefs, her want to believe the best in people and not have that robbed from her. So I want to focus here on scene 5 for our first point, because there's so much going on in the scene and so much of it happens implicitly that is not said. So it begins with just Father Flynn and Sister Aloysius. Sister Aloysius is on the telephone, and Father Flynn comes in. He says, "Here, good morning, Sister Aloysius. How are you today?" She says, "Good morning, Father Flynn." And you see here, he takes a step into the office. He asks, "Are we ready for the meeting?" And Sister Aloysius says, "We're just short of Sister James," meaning she's not here, and we need her to be there. So if you notice the stage direction, nothing else is said, but the stage direction is that Father Flynn steps back into the doorway. Now, the reason for this is there was a sort of an unwritten rule at the time that a priest and a nun could not be alone together, either in a private conference, a private meeting of some kind, whether it be indoors, outdoors, public, private. So keep this in mind, because I'm going to trace this all the way into a future scene that involves Father Flynn and Sister James. All right, so he stays there. They kind of have some small talk, and then Sister James comes rushing in. Am I past the time? And then notice here, finally, Father Flynn takes a step into the office. All right, and so they begin talking, and Sister Aloysius offers Father Flynn a cup of tea. And he says, yes, I would like to have some. And while this is happening, look at what. Now remember, Father Flynn is of the belief that he was brought in to the office, or called into the office, just on a sort of a minor matter. Has no idea that they're about to bring up something as weighty as possible child abuse. But notice what happens. As they're talking about the tea, they come in and sit down. Father Flynn takes Sister Aloysius' chair. He's sitting at her desk. She reacts but says nothing. So right away, even though this is not his office, he makes it clear that he's the one in charge. He, in the hierarchical church, he has a superior position to Sister Aloysius. So even though she's the principal of the school, it's her office, he shows her who's boss by sitting in her chair. This continues when they ask for sugar. Father Flynn, they pour the tea for him. He says, is there sugar? Sister Aloysius says, sugar, yes, it's here somewhere. I put it in the drawer for Lent last year and never remembered to take it out. Father Flynn says it mustn't have been much to give up then. So for those who are not familiar, in the Catholic tradition, during the Easter season, during Lent, children, really everyone, but people are asked to sacrifice something. So if you like chocolate, then you give up chocolate for 40 days, the 40 days of Lent. And a lot of times kids will be like, well, I'm going to give up broccoli. And you're like, no, that's not the point. You don't give up something that you don't like. You give up something that you really, really like, because it's a sacrifice. And that sacrifice is supposed to mirror the sacrifice that Jesus gave his life for us. So this is a little dig on Father Flynn's part. The fact that, she gave up Lent and never remembered to take it out. And he says, well, it must not have been too much of a sacrifice for you. And she says, no, I'm sure you're right. So right now she's kind of playing along. But notice a couple things that happen here. She begins to kind of make her assumptions about him. She looks at his fingernails. She says, your fingernails? And he says, I wear them a little long. And she's kind of taken aback by this. And then he asks about the sugar. She says, oh, yes, one, meaning like one scoop or one lump. He says 3. And she repeats it. She's appalled, but tries to hide it. And he admits that he has a sweet tooth. So, in her mind, this is an indulgence, right? This is, if she has these beliefs, she's already made up her mind that Father Flynn is guilty. She's looking for opportunities to connect the dots. She's looking for evidence that makes him someone of a weak character, someone of a, the sort of person who would take advantage of a child, right? And to her, even something as small as liking 3 scoops of sugar in his tea as opposed to just one, having long fingernails, those are pieces of evidence that to her suggests that, yes, he is in fact a child molester. We continue on. They begin talking about, and this is the ruse. This is the so-called reason that they called him in, because they want to talk about the Christmas pageant. And Father Flynn, again, he's someone who is a progressive. He wants to include people in the Christian faith in new ways. And Sister Aloysius is all about tradition. So here he says, we all love Christmas hymns, but it might be jolly to include a secular song. And you can tell she's a little doubtful here. He says, yeah, it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas, something like that. And she asks, what would be the point of performing a secular song? And he says fun, as if it's something that Sister Aloysius has never heard of. Sister James suggests Frosty the Snowman. Father Flynn says, well, that's a good one. We could have one of the boys dress as a snowman and dance around. And look at what Sister Aloysius does. She asks, which boy? Now, do you see what she's doing here? She wanted to see if Father Flynn would recommend, of course, Donald Muller. Now, he gets out of that by saying we do tryouts. But then she regroups and she goes back on the attack. Frosty the Snowman espouses a pagan belief in magic. The snowman comes to life when an enchanted hat is put on his head. If the music were more somber, people would realize the images are disturbing and the song heretical. Sister James and Father Flynn exchange a look. Sister James says, I never thought about it that way. And Father Flynn is sort of deadpan, ironic comment. All right, so not Frosty the Snowman. So the fact that he'd want to do a secular song that promotes heretical beliefs, again, that's strike number 3 against Father Flynn. Long fingernails, too much sugar, Frosty the Snowman. And then this is kind of the coup de grace here is when he's writing notes in a small notebook. He says he keeps notes for ideas for a sermon. Sister Aloysius says, may I ask what you wrote down with that ballpoint pen? And you remember back from scene 2 when they're talking about the children, the students in Sister James's class, and Sister Aloysius bemoans how all children these days are using ballpoint pens. It's too easy. It's the easy way out. In her mind, everyone should be forced to write with a fountain pen because it forces you to write with better penmanship. So all of this is, again, suggestive of a certain kind of character trait in Father Flynn that Sister Aloysius has of him. Father Flynn, for his part, doesn't back down. He still wants to kind of keep this push toward being progressive, taking the church into the 20th century, the 21st century. He says, I think a message of the Second Ecumenical Council was that the church needs to take on a more familiar face, reflect the local community. We should sing a song from the radio now and then, take the kids out for ice cream. Again, you can imagine Sister Aloysius' face here when she repeats the words ice cream. Maybe take the boys on a camping trip. We should be friendlier. We remember that, Sister Aloysius tells Sister James in scene 2 that, the children have friends. What they need is an authority figure. And clearly all the things that Father Flynn is suggesting here, it goes exactly against her mantra, her way of thinking. Now, finally, it gets to Donald Muller. Sister Aloysius forces the issue. She says, back to the Christmas pageant, we must be careful how Donald Muller is used in the pageant. And, again, they're going back to the idea that he's the only African-American student in the parish. And Father Flynn says, no, I think he should be treated like every other boy. And this is where she pounces. You yourself singled the boy out for special attention. You held a private meeting with him at the rectory. So now now it's all on the table. And she starts to prod, she starts to push. She asks him, why did he act strangely? You could tell that he's starting to get a little uncomfortable. He even says it. Well, I feel a little uncomfortable. Something about your tone. He understands that there's some suggestion here that he's not very happy with. Okay, sorry, I had to switch computers there for a moment. Was having a little technical difficulty. So I want to put a bow on this now and wrap up point number 1. The way this scene ends, again, there's so much here that's left unsaid. The subtext being the kind of the call of the day here. So Father Flynn, right before he leaves the stage, says, I'm not pleased with how you handled this, sister. Next time you are troubled by dark ideas, I suggest you speak to the Monsignor. And then he leaves. This is a veiled threat. Obviously, he is essentially saying, if you bring this up again, it will probably cost you your job, to Sister Aloysius. Sister James, for her part, wants to just sweep this under the rug. She says she's convinced. Sister Aloysius doesn't believe her. And pretty accurately, she says, you just want things to be resolved so you can have your simplicity back. Sister James all but confirms that. I want no further part of this. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about Sister Aloysius, or really all characters in this play, sticking to their beliefs, not being flexible, not being willing to budge from what their convictions tell them. I'll bring him down with or without your help, she says. So scene 5 ends essentially with the wheels set in motion. Here also we see the groundwork is being laid for a later scene in which Sister Aloysius is calling Donald Muller's mother, and that will be a later scene which we'll get to. Just again, to wrap up the notion of subtext here, in scene 6 is meant to mirror scene 1, whereas scene 1 had some merit in the sense that Father Flynn is speaking to his congregation, telling them it's okay to have doubt. There might be some spiritual value to that. I would ask, is there any spiritual value to the sermon he gives in scene 6 about intolerance? Remember, he admitted to Sister Aloysius and Sister James that he was coming up with ideas and writing in his little notebook about a theme for his next homily, which would be intolerance. All this all this sermon here really is about is, as he says here at the end, gossip. And I think what we're supposed to understand is he takes this opportunity to abuse his pulpit and send sort of basically extend the threat that he had made to Sister Aloysius in scene 5. So he uses his position as a priest, he uses his authority, and he uses the sacred moment of a Sunday Mass, a liturgy, to carry out his own personal agenda, which is on some level really sort of reprehensible. But for the most part, 95% of the congregation that day presumably would not really have understood the undercurrent of this sermon. Scene 7 has its own subtext, as I was saying before. Remember that moment when Father Flynn walks into Sister Aloysius's office at the beginning of scene 5, and he realizes that Sister James is not there, and it's because he can't be one-on-one in a private setting with a nun, he steps back into the doorway. Here, he puts aside all pretense, and he has this private meeting. Now, they're in the garden, they're outside, but he has a private meeting with Sister James. The point of this meeting being that he's trying to essentially recruit her over to his side. Much of the discussion here is basically saying, "Hey, look, I'm trying to run my congregation with some human feeling." He's trying essentially to turn Sister James against Sister Aloysius. He tells her here, "I've done nothing. There's no substance to any of this. The most innocent actions can appear sinister to the poisoned mind," bringing us back again to that notion of how signals, signs can be misread, how there all are these subtextual ideas that run underneath the surface. Here again, Father Flynn, look at how he's abusing his position here. She, meaning Sister Aloysius, she sees me talk in a human way to these children, and she immediately assumes there must be something wrong with it, something dirty. Well, I'm not going to let her keep this parish in the dark ages, and I'm not going to let her destroy my spirit of compassion. So what we don't know here is what Father Flynn has really done or not done. And one of our last points I'll make later in the video is about, does he ever make a confession? Does he ever admit to doing anything? We'll look at that for a bit, but I want to wrap this point up right now that the subtext that begins really has been present from the beginning of the play, but that reaches its high pitch in scene 5 is important for the play for those reasons I mentioned earlier, in the sense that the church had been secretive, had swept under the covers, under the rug, this misbehavior that the priests had engaged in for a long time. And number 2, the way in which people will read signs and make them fit their vision, their perspective of things. So I'm going to move now to my second point. So the second point I want to explore with you more briefly is the play's concern with inequalities. And the play does this in a couple of different ways. I said before that it's fitting that the play is set in 1964. Father Flynn, in his opening sermon in scene 1, references the Kennedy assassination. And a lot of historians look back and frame this time period as being one in which the United States and American citizens lost their innocence. There was a lot of optimism, a lot of hope for a young president with new ideas, progressive attitudes. And when he was killed, some of that optimism and innocence was lost. Another significant thing about the year 1964 was the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Now, a lot of people associate the Civil Rights Act of 1964 with race and racial inequality. And that's true. It is associated with race, but it was more than just race. It was, you cannot discriminate based on gender and religion and a number of other different variables. So that's certainly true in the play. I mentioned earlier that Sister Aloysius says at one point to Sister James, "Men run everything," and it's been well established that the church is hierarchical. She is not to go out of the proper channel if she has a concern with the priest, as she does with Father Flynn, a very grave concern. She must go through the order, the pecking order, and her concern is that if she reports this in the proper channel, it'll be swept under the rug, as we know from movies like Spotlight and the reporting that's been done. That has been historically the practice that churches have taken to protect priests that have abused their position. I think in the scene in which Sister Aloysius calls Donald Muller's mother to her office for a chat is one that really highlights a lot of the inequities that are present in the play. It's been also well established that Donald is the only African American student at the church, in the church parish in the school, and Sister Aloysius is fearful of that, and she assumes from the start that he will be picked on because of this. But in this discussion between Mrs. Muller and Sister Aloysius, we see a lot of this discussion, this acknowledgement that men run everything. On page 43, Mrs. Muller, toward the bottom of the page here, says, "That's because that's the way it is. You're just finding out about it, but that's the way it is, and it's the way it's been, sister. You're not going against no man in a robe and win, sister. He's got the position." Now, some readers look at this scene and, for instance, when Sister Aloysius says, "He's got your son," and Mrs. Muller says, "Let him have him then." A lot of people read this and they're sort of confused. Like, why would a mother knowingly give her son up to a man who's abusing him? And she makes it clear to Sister Aloysius that there's more going on here than she realizes. It's a more complicated situation. She says, why you need to know something like that for sure when you don't? Please, sister, you got some kind of a righteous cause going with this priest, and now you want to drag my boy into it. My son doesn't need additional difficulties. Let him take the good and leave the rest when he leaves this place in June. He knows how to do that. I taught him how to do that. And Sister Aloysius kind of accuses her here of being what kind of mother are you? This is Sister Aloysius with her very rigid code of morality. But Mrs. Muller, being a black woman at this time, excuse me, but you do not know enough about life to say a thing like that. And a lot of this is acknowledgement, this sort of moral compromises that have to be made in a society in which a white male, particularly a white male of the cloth like Father Flynn, would be, wouldn't be challenged, or if he would be challenged, anyone who would challenge him would be set up for failure. There's an additional suggestion here toward the bottom of page 44 that Donald Muller is possibly homosexual. Mrs. Muller says, Sister Aloysius asks, "What are you telling me?" Mrs. Muller says, "I'm his mother. I'm talking about his nature now, not anything he's done, but you can't hold a child responsible for what God gave him to be." And Mrs. Muller repeats, "But there's the boy's nature." And Sister Aloysius doesn't want to consider that. Mrs. Muller acknowledges that my boy came to the school because they were going to kill him at the public school. So we were lucky enough to get him here for the last year. His father don't like him. He comes here. The kids don't like him. But the priest puts out a hand to the boy. So she acknowledges that there may be something going on here. There may be some sort of improper relationship. But Father Flynn is being kind to him. He may be other things to him, but he's being kind to him. And given his very vulnerable situation, Mrs. Muller is sort of willing to accept that. So it may seem like a moral compromise, but that's the nature of the world in which we live, that there are no black and white issues. There are shades of gray. There are moral compromises sometimes that need to be made, and the fault is in society. One last acknowledgement here, and this scene morphs into something very different after Mrs. Muller leaves. Father Flynn comes in to Sister Aloysius' office, and this time it's just one-on-one. Remember that there's rules against a priest and a nun being alone together, and Father Flynn isn't having it. He's very angry in this scene, and he basically calls her out and says, "What are you accusing me of?" Father Flynn, one more time here, falls back on the notion of the superiority he has as a right, as a man, as a white man, as a priest, a person of the cloth. You have no right to act on your own. You are a member of a religious order. You have taken vows, obedience being one. You answer to us. You have no right to step outside the church. You answer to us could just as easily be you as a woman answer to us, men. But additionally, there's the further layer here that you as a nun, as part of the hierarchical structure of the church, answer to priests. So the play, this is one of the ways in which the play brings spiritual, philosophical concerns to more of a particular historical moment in society by acknowledging that there are inequities in the 1960s. I mean, there was inequities in the 21st century, certainly. But in this time when there was this presumed upward trajectory of improvement, we're getting better as a society, we're becoming more aware. This play calls attention to the fact that we are not there yet. All right, I'm going to stop this point, and I'd like to just one last point to explore with you. Okay, the third and final point I want to make for this lecture and to set you up as a preview for the mini quiz that you're about to take after this, if you watch this video. I want to come all the way back to the top of the document. This is, let's see, what page? This looks like about page 11 in the PDF link. There are three epigraphs. An epigraph is typically a quote that an author uses, and not necessarily of a play, but any literary work. It's a quotation from another work, another author that a playwright or an author will use to help, I guess, frame or provide a context of some sort, whether it be a literary context, historical context, religious context. And here the playwright Shanley gives three epigraphs. The first is "The Bad Sleep Well," the title of a Kurosawa film. The second is "In much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow," from Ecclesiastes. And then finally, "Everything that is hard to attain is easily assailed by the mob." I'd like to focus for now on the second epigraph. This is from Ecclesiastes, which is a book from the Old Testament. "In much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow." So I'd like to talk about how that connects to the final parts of the play, and it's a pretty dramatic ending to the play. Perhaps you've heard the phrase "ignorance is bliss." There's this idea that, sometimes it's better not to know things, right? You're better off not knowing, because the more knowledge you have, the more awareness you have, the more impact it could have on you as a person. So I think in some way that phrase, "ignorance is bliss," derives from Ecclesiastes. "In much wisdom is much grief." It's sort of the opposite of "ignorance is bliss." But this connects to the very end of the play. So let's fast forward. Actually, let's look at the very end of scene 8. This is where Sister Aloysius and Father Flynn have their mano a mano showdown. And Sister Aloysius gets the upper hand. She wins, essentially. It gets to the point where, and I've said before that we never know for sure whether Father Flynn did what Sister Aloysius accuses him of. But this is as close as we come in this play to making explicit something that's been implicit or subtextual throughout the play. Father Flynn, and this is page 49, toward the end of scene 8, which is the penultimate scene of the play, Father Flynn says, "Please, are we people? Am I a person, flesh and blood, like you, or are we just ideas and convictions? I can't say everything. Do you understand? There are things I can't say. Even if you can't imagine the explanation, sister, remember, there are circumstances beyond your knowledge. Even if you feel certainty, it is an emotion, not a fact. In the spirit of charity, I appeal to you. On behalf of my life's work, you have to behave responsibly. I put myself in your hands." And Sister Aloysius is not having it. She remains firm here, and she basically says, you have to take steps now, because you will be ejected from this parish. But do you see how this almost sounds like a pseudo confession? There are things I can't say. There are circumstances beyond your knowledge. It almost sounds as if he wants to say something here. He's so close, on the precipice of saying something self-incriminatory, but he doesn't say it. Now, whether that means that he actually did something criminal, immoral with Donald, we don't know. Again, the play never says. But that's as close as we come. Remembering the "wisdom increaseth sorrow," the quotation from Ecclesiastes. Sister, remember, there are circumstances beyond your knowledge. We find out that Sister Aloysius had to come up with a lie in order to frame Father Flynn, in order to get the desired outcome that she wants. She claims that she went to his prior parish and asked another nun what his history was, why he was ejected from that parish. And essentially, she claims that the nun that she spoke to at his previous parish, confirms her story, that he is in fact a child abuser, and that's the evidence that she needs. We learn in the final scene, it's a short one, the final scene of the play, that that's not true. Sister James comes back. She apparently had a sick brother. She had to go visit him. She returns in scene 9 for the final scene of the play. Sister James maintains, I don't think Father Flynn did anything wrong. Sister Aloysius is confused. No, he convinced you? Yes, he did. Did you ever prove it? What? That he interfered with Donald Muller. Did I ever prove it to whom? Anyone but yourself. No. And we're going to learn in a moment that she may not even proved it to herself. But you were sure? Yes. I wish I could be like you. Why? Because I can't sleep at night anymore. Everything seems uncertain to me. Maybe we're not supposed to sleep so well. They've made Father Flynn the pastor of St. Jerome. So out of all this, the irony is he's got a promotion by being moved to a different parish. But here's the part that I'm really interested in. Sister Aloysius admits she called a nun in the previous parish, had found out his prior history of infringements. Sister James, so you did prove it. Sister Aloysius, I was lying. I made no such call. She says, you lied? Yes, but if he had no such history, the lie wouldn't have worked. His resignation was his confession. He was what I thought he was, and he's gone. I can't believe you lied. And Sister Aloysius here echoes something she said back in scene 4. In the pursuit of wrongdoing, one steps away from God. Of course, there's a price. So she's acknowledging she did what she had to do. Now, this is the moment that I'm most interested in. I see. So he's in another school. Yes. And Sister Aloysius, for the only time in the play, she's been so firm, so rigid, so in control, she loses all that self-control. She says, oh, Sister James, what is it, sister? I have doubts. I have such doubts. Sister Aloysius is bent with emotion, and the lights fade, and the play ends. Now, we remember from the preface, the introduction that Shanley wrote to this play, that doubt can be a positive thing. It can be a moment where a person grows, where they question their facile assumptions. This is a moment of much greater pessimism, though. What it took for her to have to prove to Father Flynn that he did this thing meant that she is farther away from God. But I think one of the things that we realize here is that they're all in a greater state of knowledge. They're all in a greater awareness, even though she lied, even though she is uncertain. She's in a greater state of awareness that she and her codes, her beliefs, her convictions about the world aren't necessarily always true. So it's an irony that she's acknowledging she doesn't know things. She doesn't know everything. She doesn't have it all figured out. But in acknowledging that, she comes to a greater sense of understanding. The lack of evidence, the lack of truth brings her to a greater sense of truth with a capital T. This goes back to the Ecclesiastes epigraph, that in greater wisdom is more grief. He that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. So the opposite of ignorance is bliss here. Her greater understanding of the situation is what is what causes her to have this crisis. She's bent with emotion at the very end of the play. And I want to end here just by acknowledging that this is something we've traced throughout almost every single play that we've read, particularly in Antigone and Macbeth. Remember that Antigone, the chorus gets the final word, right? And the chorus says, that knowledge is the greatest of all human happiness, but you must not neglect anything that the gods demand. So again, you have to prostrate yourself. You have to make yourself, you have to acknowledge the superiority of the gods and that there are certain things on earth that we can't know. Macbeth, remember, there were certain things he couldn't know, and he assumed that the weird sisters, had divine knowledge. But he realizes that he had been equivocated to. So if this play is tragic at all, the tragedy here is that we can never know whether we're certain, whether we are doing what we should be doing or not. All we can know is that we're trying to do our best. but we have no evidence. Even the most faithful acknowledge they can't see God. Right? God is unknowable to us in the true sense of God and His existence, and that's a sort of a minor tragedy in itself. We go through our lives, we hope that it's good enough, we pray that it's good enough, but we never truly know. So the lack of knowledge is, in a way, a maturity. It's a maturing, just like Shanley says, but it's also something that causes us fear, causes us a sense of unease. That it would be nice to sleep soundly at night, but those who are aware, those who know, don't have that luxury. So I'm going to end here. I think it's a good place to end, obviously, on the final line of the play with the word itself, doubt, because it frames for the play the way in which that concept is primary, but also very, very complicated and uncertain. So after this, now you'll go and take the mini quiz. The mini quiz should follow the 3 points that we made here. The first being about the subtexts of the play, the second being about the inequities of the play, and the third being about the way in which the play treats the idea of knowledge and doubt. All right, thank you for listening. I know this is, again, a longer one. I appreciate your having watched this, and good luck with the quiz.